Hello, I want to talk about chunking today and seeing individual notes as groups formed into chords. And I'm going to look at the three pieces that I've attached in the email. So chunking is something that I try to do whenever I'm reading music, especially if it's new music, a new piece of music. I'll try and group the notes together into chords so that I'm not reading notes one by one, which is what I used to do early on and was quite agonizing to do. But I think that we all have to get beyond that and start seeing the larger structures of music. And chords are one of the most important to start seeing, especially as a guitar player, because guitar music is founded on chords, as Aguado put it. So the first example, Lagrima, just the A section of Lagrima. You're probably familiar with it. It's a very well-known guitar piece. But if you're reading it with individual notes in mind, it is, even though it's a fairly short, not too intense piece, there are a lot of, high notes and low notes. It really goes around the fretboard quite a bit. So when you see it on the page, it looks like a lot of notes, but when you chunk the notes together, it looks like and sounds like this. So that's what it sounds like if you group the notes together into chords, and you can basically play it, all of the notes in groups. And not only is this good for sight reading, but it's also good for your left hand technique, because then you learn to make fewer movements and you learn your fingers to work together. And then musically it's good because you start to hear through all of the individual notes. It's very easy, for example, in Lagrima to sound sort of labored on every single note. Something like that, but when you play the chunks or play the chords, you play it as written, it can really give a lot more direction and coherence to your playing. The next example is another popular one by Bach, the D minor prelude from BWV 999. So this is a classic sort of arpeggio piece where the left hand is relatively still, but there is still some movement to it. But seeing the chunked notes really helps. And even though you can't necessarily play the chunked notes all together as a chord, it still really does help in a number of ways to group the notes into chords. So if I play the chunked version, this is what it sounds like. So you see how I have to modify it a little bit because I can't play all the notes together, and I want to use the same fingerings that are in the piece. That's, I guess, a key that is quite important. You want to try and make it as relevant as possible by using the same fingerings as you find in the piece. So that helps. Probably the most helpful thing about that is that you start to see how important it is that your left hand makes those changes very clear, very worked out. Because when you add the arpeggios, your right hand's working constantly, it's playing constant semiquavers, constant 16th notes, but your left hand is moving at a much slower pace, but it's still, those movements still need to be really worked out well. And then it just, as I mentioned in the email, it's something like 120 something notes in the example, in the original example, and that's just down now to 12 chords. So you really limiting the number of things you're seeing, which is actually a really good thing when you're reading music. You want to limit the number of things you see, otherwise you'll get daunted. It's like I think we're select with visual information and oral information, we're selective, but particularly with visual, if we look at like a tree, for example, visually we're probably just going to see like the trunk and some branches and some leaves, but the actual detail that's in it is too much for our brain to really comprehend. So we just take in the information that's useful for us. And so when I look at music, I try and see those structures, those chord structures, and I know them, a lot of them, because I've practiced them already on the guitar. So I can identify with them very quickly. So that this is I think a method that will help you really learn to read faster. So the last example is Danza Española number 5 by Granados, another well-known piece. I'm choosing well-known ones intentionally, so I'll play the example for you. Okay, so there's the examples. It's very complicated compared to the previous two pieces. There's a lot happening. There's complicated texture and ornaments and all that sort of thing. So chunking this is very useful, but it's perhaps a little bit more abstract compared to the actual piece. We're really starting to modify it a lot now. So the first, this bit here, the opening kind of riff, you can simplify that as a chord. You can just think of that as an E minor chord, like that. That A sharp just sort of ornaments the B like that. So you can quickly read it that way. Sometimes it's fingered on the 6th string, but it's often on the 5th string as well. So there's that E minor chord. And then as we move up, we're going to ignore those notes and we're going to go to this chord here, which is another E minor chord. And then we go to this chord, an F sharp diminished 7th chord. And then B7 to E minor. And then it sort of repeats the same thing. Then we have that riff again, up to the E minor, F sharp diminished 7th, and then it changes to D7, add 9, and to a G chord. So let me play the chunked version just straight through. Okay, so seeing it and hearing it very differently when you chunk the music. So you can apply this process to virtually any guitar piece. I think pieces that were composed in the 19th century, Saw, Aguado, Giuliani, from that era, it's very, very relevant to that era of music, because they were really very well, thoroughly trained in harmony, and they were practicing this kind of thing a lot, and it was part of their compositional process as well. So I hope this method, this putting on the chunking lenses helps you read faster and takes away some of that agony of reading one note at a time, maybe using a chart. And I hope it helps you deepen your understanding of the music you're playing too. I think that's what it does. So thanks for reading and listening.